Today you are going to hear about Ulysses S. Grant. You are going to hear about the commander of the Union Army named Ulysses S. Grant. Have you ever heard of him? I want you to listen carefully to learn about Ulysses S. Grant, and I want you to think about how he was a general like General Lee and how he was different from General Lee. The date was May 4th, 1864. The day before, marching with a strength of over 118,000 soldiers, the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rappahannock River in the middle of Virginia. The Blue Ridge Mountains lay out to the west. In the east lie miles of dark forest and the Confederate Army under the command of Robert E. Lee. General Lee had roughly 60,000 men under his command, half as many as the Union Army, but they were ready to put up a strong fight. The Union Army was commanded by Ulysses S. Grant. He was no stranger to battle. He had served in the Army for over 25 years, starting when he was just 17 years old. The Civil War was not his first war either. Like the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, General Grant had fought another war. General Ulysses S. Grant leaned against the post outside his tent. He wearily watched as the long line of supply wagons carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies rumbled past. These supply wagons made up the rear or back side of the army. The main body of the army, the soldiers, who needed all those supplies in order to fight, were miles ahead, deep in the forest, looking for the enemy. General Grant was now the general-in-chief of the entire Union Army. The only person who ranked higher than General Grant was President Lincoln. Grant took his orders from Lincoln, and everyone else took their orders from Grant. Every general in the war faced hard choices and heavy responsibilities, with the lives of thousands of soldiers in his hands. But in 1864, no general had more worries than General Grant. General Grant had spent the first 3 years of the Civil War fighting farthest west, away from the action in Virginia. His most impressive victory in the early years of the war came at Vicksburg in the city in Mississippi. The same day that the Union Army had won the Battle of Gettysburg, General Grant won the Battle of Vicksburg. After 2 long and hard months, the victory gave the Union final control over the entire Mississippi River, which in turn would make it easier for the Union to take over the rest of the South. The Mississippi River was important because the Union could use it to send troops and supplies from the north to the south. It would be easier to use the river to do this because there were no cars and no trucks yet, so there were no highways like we have today. To win the Civil War, the Union needed to control the South, including all of its cities and roads. Nobody in the North expected this to be so difficult. The Union had more than 1 million men in uniform. By the end of the Civil War, 1 out of every 10 Union soldiers was African American, and 1 out of 4 Union soldiers was African American. Factories in the North had been working day and night for years, producing weapons, uniforms, blankets, food rations, weapons, and all the other things an army would need. The Yankees, as the Union soldiers were nicknamed, had everything they needed to fight and win the war. The Confederates, or the rebels as they were often called, did not have as many as the Union. The South did not have as many factories. Many of those it did have early in the war been destroyed or captured by 1864. Confederate soldiers marched to battlefields without shoes, without enough food, and sometimes without enough ammunition. Yet, even though they were exhausted and starved, the Confederates somehow held on and managed to keep on fighting. Grant was not the general-in-chief of the Union Army at the beginning of the Civil War. Throughout the war, Lincoln had trouble with some of his top Union generals. It wasn't that they were bad generals. They could win battles and capture enemy forts and towns, but they made mistakes as well. They often waited too long to attack or failed to chase the Confederates when they were on the run. Basically, Lincoln felt the Union generals were never aggressive or forceful enough. But Grant was different. General Grant had won the long battle of Vicksburg because he was stubborn and unafraid. He kept fighting and attacking until his enemy surrendered. Lincoln put Grant in charge of the entire Union army because General Grant promised that he would do whatever it took to win. He would chase General Lee and his army all over Virginia and would not stop until the war was finished. This outlook earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender, because he would never accept nothing less from the Confederate army than a complete surrender. General Grant removed the folded letter from his breast pocket. President Lincoln had sent the letter a few days earlier. It did not contain any vital information or new orders. It was just a simple letter sent to wish him luck in a battle. Grant reread the letter, written in the president's own writing. The following historic letter was modified for ease of understanding. Lieutenant General Grant, not expected to see you again before the march into Virginia, I wish to tell you that I am entirely satisfied with what you have done to this time. You are alert and self-reliant, and pleased with this, I do not wish to control your actions in any way. If there is anything wanting which is within my power to give, do not fail to let me know. And, with a brave army and a just cause, may God sustain you. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. The next day, May 5th, in the forest of Fredericksburg, Virginia, the main body of Grant's army clashed with the General Lee's army in one of the wildest battles of the war. In those days, armies always preferred to fight in open fields, where it was easier to move cannons and large groups of men, and easier for generals to see what was happening. This time, though, the armies met deep in the woods, where the trees and the plant growth was so heavy that the soldiers could barely see one another. This was called the Battle of the Wilderness, and it was the very first time General Grant and Lee faced each other in a battle. It was a very chaotic battle. Thousands were killed and wounded. At the end of the day, both armies limped away, no clearer winner in the battle. After the battle, many of the Union wounded were taken to churches and homes in nearby city of Fredericksburg. Clara Barton was one of those in the churches, tending the wounds of soldiers. The next day, hundreds more wounded soldiers were brought in from another battle, and it went on. Armies of Grant and Lee met again and again during the months that followed. Sometimes Grant won the battle, sometimes Lee won, sometimes nobody won. But each battle, the Confederate army got a little smaller, and it was that much closer to defeat.